been asked to be the spokesman to what you're about to see.
I feel very much like a man who is condemned to death does when the time of his execution draws nigh. So, you want to be president? Are you sure? All right then, first a few questions. Have you had your 35th birthday? Were you born in the USA? And have you spent 14 of your 35 plus years actually in the country?
Please don't go away.
Oh, and can you confirm you haven't incited rebellion against the United States?
The May Day manual advised people to bring soap to share with fellow demonstrators.
If you can answer yes to all of the above, you are theoretically eligible to run for the most powerful job on the planet. Yay! But what exactly are you letting yourself in for? You may want to sit down. There's an awful lot of history in the world. Too much, really. So let's skip all the boring stuff and get straight to the interesting bits. Sit back while we bring you the surprising, funny, frightening, and sometimes downright odd true stories about what people in the past were getting up to and how to make it all work for you. This is History. The interesting bits. Congratulations, you meet all the basic requirements. Good for you. It's time to run for president. The bad news, you're just one of 100 million qualified candidates. And the good news, most of them will almost certainly be wholly unsuitable for the job.
When you're thinking about the personality traits of leaders in general and presidents in particular, you want to avoid people who are narcissistic, people who are psychopathic, people who are Machiavellian. These are traits that often lead people into positions of power, but when they have power, make them disastrous failures. The president, after all, is one of only 2 people on Earth who has the ability to end human civilization on a whim.
But you, of course, have only the best whims. So let's go. Firstly, you're going to have to stand out from the crowd. History shows that if you want to be Commander-in-Chief, it helps if you're willing to devote your every waking moment to the service of your country. We're a war hero, or a lawyer, laugh in the face of premature aging, can raise vast sums of money, and have a Y chromosome. On that last point, for a long time it was a constitutional grey area as to whether a woman could even run for the top job. But thankfully, they did anyway, starting in 1872 with Victoria Woodhull, journalist and suffragist.
The first woman to run for president runs on the Equal Rights Party. She is a proponent of free love, which at the time really meant that you could take on a partner and leave that partner without the kind of bounds of the legal system of asking for permission.
Which got her labelled indecent in 1872. But she fought back.
She takes on one of her fiercest critics, Reverend Beecher. Beecher himself was involved in a very torrid affair with a parishioner, of which Woodhull gives very titillating details in her newspaper. On the day of the election, though, Woodhull finds herself in jail. She has been arrested on the violation of obscenity, so even if she could have voted for herself, she wouldn't have been able to.
Things did get a little easier for female candidates. They just had to wait for 92 more years. Until the 1964 election, when Margaret Chase Smith threw her name into the ring as a Republican candidate.
She gets nominations in really big states like Texas, Massachusetts. She is really notable for being able to kind of move the party along and move women along in such a momentous way.
Margaret was the first woman to be in the running for a major party's nomination. A few years later, another candidate would push it even further.
Mrs. Chisholm, why do you want to be President of the United States?
I want to be President of the United States because I'm very concerned about the direction in which this country is moving.
Shirley Chisholm is an iconic congresswoman from New York, the first African-American woman to run for the office of the presidency.
In 1972, she was the first woman, and first woman of color, to be placed in nomination at the Democratic Party's convention. Not that the party really got behind her.
Shirley Chisholm is prohibited from participating in the presidential debate for the reasons that she is not seen as a legitimate candidate. They want to give the space to men, to people that they think are going to be serious, and she seems so far out of left field, her campaign not taken seriously, that she doesn't get the television space.
Instead, the Democrats went with George McGovern. Of course, that was all a long time ago. Let's check how the male-to-female presidential ratio stands in the first quarter of the 21st century.
There have been 46 presidents, and we've broken down all the complex statistics and put them in a graph, which reveals a breakdown of male versus female presidents. In the male column, we have 46. And how many female presidents do we have? 0.
Smith and Chisholm may have been outsiders, but they knew one thing. If you're serious about running, you really need to hitch your wagon to either the Democratic or Republican parties. Candidates do stand from other parties, but let's not kid ourselves. If you want to win, every president since 1853 has come from one of the two parties. The only president not to represent any political party was the father of his country, George Washington. Not that he wanted the presidency at all. It was just a bit less controversial than his other job offer. Which was king. Washington felt that this might rather defeat the object of winning a revolutionary war. He wasn't that keen on president either. A prospect, he said, made him feel like a man whose execution draws nigh. Oh, buck up, George. Technically, Washington wasn't even the first US president. There were 14 continental presidents in line before him, though they were more presiding officers than the elected heads of an independent nation. A lawyer named Peyton Randolph was the first. Who wants to live in Randolph, D.C.? George Washington never actually made a run for power. It sort of fell into his lap. But his service in the American Revolution established a crucial fact for all those who followed him into the top job. Everybody loves a war hero.
There's a feeling that at least people with military background have demonstrated their willingness to put their lives on the line in service to something greater than themselves. And that, I think, provides some people some assurance that when we give someone the power of the presidency, they will use it to our benefit instead of their own.
So before you sign up for a presidential run, you might want to sign on to the military. Go and fight a war. Or even better, win one.
He thought he could break up our partnership, but we were welded together by fighting for one great cause.
Let's take a look at how many presidents have military experience. Of the 46 presidents, a whopping 31 served in the military. We can divide that up further. Of those 31 who served, 24 were Army or militia. 6 were Navy or Naval Reserve, and just 1 was US Air Force, George W. Bush, a fighter pilot with the Texas Air National Guard. And his father, George Bush Sr., a Navy pilot, was the last US president to see combat.
One of the most fearsome military men to run for president was the 18th, Ulysses S. Grant. Small, dangerous, and massively thirsty most of the time. He took General Lee's surrender at the end of the Civil War and oversaw Reconstruction in the South. No wonder he needed a drink. Teddy Roosevelt began his race to the White House the moment he charged up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. A genuine tough guy. Look at him, riding a moose. Well, actually, the famous doctored image of Teddy riding a moose was an early example of fake news. But it proved a big hit on the campaign trail. Of course, it helps to choose the right side in the right fight. World War II was ideal.
That spirit of free people, working, fighting, and living together in one great cause.
Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike to his friends, earned his stripes as Supreme Allied Commander on D-Day. And in 1952, he stormed the beaches again, winning the presidency by a landslide.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
His successor, John F. Kennedy, won a Navy and Marine Corps medal for saving several of his crewmates in a sea of boiling oil. When asked how he became a hero, he answered, "It was involuntary. They sank my boat." So you've armed yourself with a chest full of medals and maybe even overcome some endemic prejudice. Now all you need to do is win.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
It could be the size of your war chest rather than the medals on your chest that makes the difference. So how much cash does it really take to run for president?
Abe Lincoln's winning campaign in 1860 reportedly cost $100,000. His opponent, Stephen Douglas, spent half that. In present-day terms, Lincoln spent just under $3.5 million. Speed forward to 1960. John F. Kennedy wins the White House after a campaign that raised $9.7 million. In fact, his fund was lower than Richard Nixon's by about $400,000. In present-day terms, JFK would have had a war chest of over $90 million compared to Nixon's $102 million. Seems like no amount of extra dollars could compensate for the beads of sweat on Nixon's forehead.
The 2020 election made history in that Joe Biden's was the first campaign to raise more than $1 billion from donors, even more than Donald J. Trump's $774 million. So what do you need all that money for? Well, firstly, you'll want one of those expensive campaign teams. Especially when the other side starts throwing mud, which they will. Smearing your opponent is a rich political tradition. Both Chester A. Arthur and Barack Obama fought smear campaigns claiming they were born outside the USA. Arthur in Canada, Obama in Kenya.
Last November, some 70 million American citizens cast secret ballots to determine who would fill this chair. The choice was John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
So help me God.
There have only been two Catholic presidents, JFK and Joe Biden. And no one from a non-Christian background has yet been nominated. In 1921, America welcomed its first Baptist president, Warren G. Harding. Journalist H.L. Mencken memorably described his campaign speeches as sounding like dogs barking idiotically through endless nights. So it seems inexplicable that Harding defeated his rival, James M. Cox. He did, though, beating him by a comfortable 26.2%. Harding had a secret weapon. His was the first campaign to put an advertising exec in charge and spend a fortune on marketing and media to sell the candidate to the voters. Thanks, Warren! If all this seems just too exhausting, there is a grim route to the Oval Office that doesn't require winning the presidency yourself. As vice president, if anything untoward happens to the boss, then you become president by default. In 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became the youngest ever president at 42, when he assumed office following the assassination of President McKinley.
A dark page in the annals of America has been written to the crack of an assassin's bullet.
In 1963, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One just over 2 hours after JFK was assassinated in Dallas. But the president doesn't need to die for you to get his job. Take Gerald Ford, who replaced Richard Nixon.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
Ford stepped up when Nixon resigned rather than face impeachment over the Watergate scandal.
You can think of the presidents of the United States as being divided into two types, filtered and unfiltered. Filtered presidents have risen up through the system with the consent and often support of political elites. The other type is unfiltered presidents. These are people, usually outsiders, or who take power by accident. You have Abraham Lincoln or Theodore Roosevelt. So they're either really successful or disastrous failures.
Ford's term got off to a bad start when he immediately pardoned his ex-boss, which may explain why he lost to Jimmy Carter in the next election. But Nixon's career does embody one of the golden rules of winning the presidency. Be persistent.
The Republican nominee has extended the role of the office beyond that of any vice president before him.
Nixon was Eisenhower's VP for 2 terms and thought he was a shoo-in for the presidency when he ran against John F. Kennedy in 1960.
At Chicago last July, Vice President Richard M. Nixon was viewed almost unanimously as the Republican Party's natural successor to Dwight D. Eisenhower.
One sweaty TV debate later, and some unusual shenanigans in the state of Illinois, meant Nixon came up short. In 1962, he ran for governor of California and lost again. He was clearly missing the secret weapon that won him the role of VP in 1953.
You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog, and our little girl Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers.
Well, everyone loves a puppy. Finally, in 1968, with no help from Checkers, Nixon got his big day.
Let's look at the biggest landslides in US presidential elections. We're defining a landslide in terms of the highest vote percentage in the Electoral College. So in third place, the 1972 result for Richard Nixon with 96.65%, winning every state but Massachusetts. That doesn't guarantee a comfortable stay in the White House. He resigned 2 years into that term because of Watergate. In second place with 97.58% was the great communicator Ronald Reagan in 1984. And his total of 525 electoral votes is the highest number ever received by a presidential candidate. But with 98.49% of the Electoral College vote, the biggest election landslide in US history was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's victory in 1936, securing every state except Maine and Vermont.
So this is it. The votes have been counted, probably several times, and by fair means or foul, you've won. It's time to get presidential. The bleachers are erected. Your historic address is in your pocket. The crowds, and possibly the clouds, are already gathering.
Despite sub-freezing temperatures, hundreds of thousands watch the ceremonies in front of the Capitol.
Welcome to the inauguration, the friendly transition of power we've heard so much about. Or not so friendly. In 1837, Andrew Jackson wanted to hand things over personally to his old friend Martin Van Buren, starting the tradition that the departing president travels to the ceremony with the new one. Unless the old one's in a bit of a huff.
So one of our earliest examples is the case of John Adams. He and Thomas Jefferson have a huge falling out. John Adams does not attend Jefferson's inauguration. He actually leaves at 4 a.m. the morning of the inauguration to avoid crossing paths with his successor.
Hoover is for continuing the noble experiment, and he promises a chicken in every pot.
Herbert Hoover, another one-term president, was similarly upset with his replacement, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Ideologically, the two men were poles apart. And in the 4 months between winning the presidency and taking office, FDR blocked all of Hoover's ideas for solving the Great Depression.
And so he's really trying to get FDR to sign off on these programs, which FDR won't do because these are the very things he runs against. By the time inauguration rolls around, Hoover is so upset with FDR that he refuses to speak to him. So they have these photo ops, but they're not interacting.
But enough about losers. You've got a speech to make. Your inaugural address can define your presidency. Or in the worst-case scenario, end it. William Henry Harrison's 1841 inaugural speech, delivered hatless in an ice storm, went on so long it killed him, 1 month later, of pneumonia. At 2 hours of incoherent tedium, it's a wonder it didn't kill the crowd too. Other inauguration addresses have gone down a little better. Kennedy's "Ask not what your country can do for you," or Lincoln's promise to bind up the nation's wounds at the height of the Civil War. But sometimes a presidency has disaster written all over it from day one. Lincoln's second inauguration was swamped with security, almost as great as that in 2021. But that didn't stop his eventual killer, John Wilkes Booth, watching the event just yards away from the president. By Nixon's second big day, 100,000 protesters lined the route, with troops posted every 10 feet. But at least those protesting Tricky Dick kept their clothes on. Unlike those who opposed George W. Bush's 2001 victory. However, not all election victories are met with such hostility. And you might even get to walk the 1.7 miles to your new home.
Andrew Jackson is actually the first president to walk to the White House during his inauguration. He's so excited, so happy to be president. He invites all of these revelers and well-wishers back to the White House. They end up having a raucous party. They completely trash the White House.
Now you've settled into the executive residence, it's time to get down to the real business of government, choosing a presidential pet. Recent presidents have largely been content with cats and dogs, except Donald Trump, who is averse to all forms of furry friend. Earlier presidents, however, were much less afraid to go exotic. John Quincy Adams kept an alligator in the bathroom. Buchanan had bald eagles. First Lady Grace Coolidge adopted a pet raccoon named Rebecca. In fact, she and her husband Calvin treated the White House like a zoo, sharing it with lion cubs, a hippo, and a bear. Teddy Roosevelt also filled the place with wildlife, although to save on the cleaning, he'd already shot most of it. Once you've settled a cat in, it's finally time to get on with your presidential duties. Things like signing legislation.
He signed bills into law while traveling northeast across the China Sea.
Wandering around with other world leaders. Making rambling speeches. And appointing friendly judges to the Supreme Court. These things will define your legacy. And might even earn you a place in Gutzon Borglum's vast presidential staring competition.
As a tribute to American democracy, Borglum had decided to carve the world's largest memorial out of the solid granite of the Black Hills.
These 60-foot-high faces were created over 14 years by 400 men and an awful lot of dynamite. Amazingly, nobody died in the making. It's almost as though someone was watching over the construction. But in fact, no matter what you achieve as president, having your face carved into Mount Rushmore is no longer an option, as the Black Hills have been reclaimed as land sacred to the Lakota Sioux. But you're not in this for the vast monuments. You're in it to make a difference.
Thank you all very, very much.
So don't get sunk by that old enemy, scandal.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
The most important things you have to avoid from now on are armed conflict, tanking the world's economy, and scandal. But that can be tricky.
The idea of what is scandalous, it really changes over time, right?
When it comes to scandalous periods in American history, one particularly shameful chapter stands alone.
So the relationship of U.S. presidents to slavery is very contentious. It's very controversial. These men owned other human beings. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the founding principles of democracy, of equality for all.
In fact, at least 12 presidents enslaved people, including George Washington.
He's also the only president to free his enslaved people upon his death.
When the story broke of Jefferson's affair with enslaved woman Sally Hemings, it was the interracial and extramarital aspects of the story that were scandalous at the time, not her enslavement. Jefferson may have been the first president to find himself embroiled in a sex scandal, but would hardly be the last. However, few have a record to rival one-man scandal machine, Warren G. Harding. Genuinely, Harding could not keep his vice president in his pants. He was so fond of it, he gave it a nickname, Jerry. He wasn't the only one. Lyndon B. Johnson had his pants specially tailored to accommodate Jumbo, and his willingness to display it at the drop of a hat would more than raise eyebrows today.
Wherever the president goes, the White House goes with him.
OBJ had many important meetings in the toilet, or in the shower, or in bed with his wife. And it did not matter like where he was going or what he was doing. If you were in conversation with him, it did not matter who you were. These things continued as he went about his day.
LBJ is not the only president with a relaxed take on bathroom etiquette, as visiting British Prime Minister Winston Churchill discovered during World War II.
Just as Churchill was climbing out of the bath, stark naked, FDR just bowled into his bathroom and barked United Nations at him because he was so excited that he'd come up with the name, and Churchill was standing there naked and just went, good.
JFK risked a different kind of exposure on an almost industrial scale.
John F. Kennedy basically had a conveyor belt of women coming in and out of the Oval Office. Secret Service agents used to help smuggle John F. Kennedy's mistresses into the White House. They just thought it was part of their job. And that is why they are called the Secret Service, because whatever they see, they're not going to reveal it.
While my answers were legally accurate, I did not volunteer information.
But even by today's standards, 55-year-old Warren G. Harding, whose administration was corrupt in all kinds of ways, was in a league of his own. Within earshot of Florence, his long-suffering First Lady, Harding had regular, noisy sex in the coat closets of the White House. Usually with Nan Britton, a teenager he'd met on the campaign trail, and with whom he fathered a daughter in the year before his election. So enthusiastic was Harding that the New York Vice Squad once felt compelled to break down the door of his hotel room. He penned pornographic love notes to his many mistresses and named each of their lady parts.
One of Harding's most famous kind of lines through his press corps is that if I were a woman, I would always be pregnant. I can't say no.
It's hardly surprising, then, that Harding died of a heart attack 3 years into his first term. Nor are the persistent rumours that Florence suffocated him. 66 years earlier, rumours were spread about another commander-in-chief.
Many people in the public think that James Buchanan was our first gay president. Was he gay? Maybe. Maybe not. What we know for sure is that he had a long-term, close relationship with William Rufus King, who was a fellow congressman from Alabama.
The two had previously lived together, and neither had married.
What I think is most interesting about James Buchanan is that he bucks heteronormative trends around the presidency. The expectation of the president is that he has a wife. And this was not lost on his political opponents, who oftentimes through innuendo or outright attacks that we today would classify as nothing but homophobia, used this against him.
Buchanan curtly dismissed the rumours as fake news. After all, he had bigger problems. He had done little to unite a country divided over slavery, and served only one term, which ended with the outbreak of civil war. Pretty much every president finds themselves beset by scandal at some point. If you can keep your nose clean, you have the potential to do things that will get your big head up there with the greats. At least metaphorically. Just get the little things right. Win a civil war. Lift the country out of the Great Depression. Or at some point, all good things must come to an end. One way or another. There are basically 7 ways in which a presidency might end. The first, and most beneficial for your mental health, is that you serve out 2 terms without giving in to any of the other 6 reasons why your presidency might end. George Washington, not keen on being president for life, established 2 strikes and you're out as a principle, but not as law, only custom.
It is, a kind of sign of success to have a 2-term presidency. The case of FDR, he's so successful, he gets 4.
FDR's marathon only ended with his death during the closing stages of World War II, 1 month into his 4th term. His successor, Harry Truman, used an unexpected turn in the Oval Office to quickly sign the 22nd Amendment into law, meaning no president could ever again serve more than 2 terms. A decision that looks wiser with each passing year. If you are lucky enough to win 2 terms, you might also live out your twilight years as an ex-president swinging away at a golf ball and building a presidential library that's bigger than any of your predecessors. If you're really good, you might get a giant memorial statue. But at the very least, you can expect hospitals, high schools, and battleships to carry your name. The lucky 44th president so far has an extinct lizard, Barack Obama Plaza in Moneygall, Ireland, and a parasitic flatworm named after him. So, that's nice. Though widely viewed as a bit lame, if you fail to be re-elected for a 2nd term, it is at least a non-violent end to your expected tenure. Your third option is to refuse to accept your party's nomination to run for a 2nd term. Widely referred to as pulling an LBJ.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Not running at all is certainly a way to avoid ways of ending your presidency number 4. Impeachment. That is to say, getting thrown out of office by Congress and the Senate, having been charged and convicted of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Andrew Johnson was the first president to be impeached, for reasons including the misuse of the power of office and a soft line on the ex-Confederate states. But unable to get a 2/3 majority to convict in Congress, Johnson got off. Talking of which,
I have offered to make every effort to make any reasonable compromise with the Congress. I still believe that, and I'm still willing to do that.
He was cleared by majority and avoided impeachment. But the best at being impeached was Donald J. Trump. He was impeached twice, but still managed to see out a full term as POTUS. One surefire way to avoid impeachment is to resign.
I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving.
Nixon is so far the only one to take the escape slide. But even resignation is a more attractive option than ways of ending your presidency number 6. Dying of natural causes. Death in office is thankfully rare. As we heard, 9th President William Henry Harrison died from a terminal inauguration, 1 month into his 1841 first term.
Upward of half a century has elapsed since the adoption of the present form of government. It would be an object more highly desirable than the gratification of the curiosity.
Yep, there are 2 more hours of that. And let me remind you, it was delivered in the open, in an ice storm. Zachary Taylor is the last president to be elected who is neither Republican nor Democrat. There are persistent rumors that he was poisoned a year into his presidency by anti-abolitionists. There is also the possibility that he died of dysentery after gorging himself on cherries and milk. Taylor was buried in an airtight steel coffin, which preserved him enough to test for traces of arsenic poisoning in 1991. The test was inconclusive, but what is certain is that if assassins didn't kill him, his doctors had a good go, prescribing vomit-inducing drugs, mercury-based medicine, and opiates. As long as there have been presidents, there have been people who wanted them dead. Ronald Reagan, Andrew Jackson, William Howard Taft, FDR, Gerald Ford, Bill Clinton, and Richard Nixon all survived attempts on their lives. The first recorded attack by an assassin was on Andrew Jackson in 1835, carrying a scar on his face inflicted by a British officer whose boots he'd refused to shine and known to have killed a man in a duel. Jackson was not the sort of chap to turn the other cheek, which his would-be assassin, house painter Richard Lawrence, soon found out.
Actually, his gun jams. At this time, it gives Jackson the ability to attack. And Jackson beats him with his cane.
A lively response from a man pushing 70 at the time.
Lawrence is subsequently arrested, and during the trial, Lawrence claims to be Richard III, and he actually tells the court that he does not respect the authority of the trial because he is the supreme sovereign of the British nation, and he will return to his country.
The real King Richard III had the perfect alibi for not attacking Andrew Jackson. He'd been dead and buried under what became this car park for 350 years.
On current available figures, as US President, you have a 43.5% chance of someone trying to kill you whilst you're in office. A serving soldier in the US military in Vietnam had a 1.7% chance of dying, whereas a serving US President has an 8.7% chance of falling to an assassin's bullet. So leaving a military career behind to sit in the Oval Office is not necessarily a safer option.
So, as you see, sadly, the risk of assassination rather comes with the job.
There are some people who just seem to be genetically or biologically just impervious to fear. So George Washington, for example, during his long military career, reported to have said that he heard the bullets whizzing by him and he thought there was something charming in the sound.
Teddy Roosevelt seems to have been of a similar mind and didn't let a little thing like a bullet stop him.
So he is on the campaign trail, an assassin shoots him, and he goes to deliver the speech, even though aides want him to depart immediately for the hospital.
When the crowd, seeing what happened, tried to kill the assassin, Roosevelt himself walked into the crowd and cried out, "Do not hurt him, do not hurt him," and stopped him from doing so, standing in front of the crowd, opening up his jacket, showing his crowd the blood-stained shirt, and saying, "It takes more than this to kill a bull moose," and then gave a speech for an hour and a half.
But we can't all be bull mooses.
Steadfast in death as in life, she accompanies her beloved on his lonely ride.
Assassination isn't a uniquely American crime, but the stats are grim.
In all, 4 presidents have fallen to an assassin's bullet: Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy. 3 out of the 4 were Republicans. These 4 killings put the USA in the lead for countries with presidential killings, edging ahead of the Dominican Republic, which has 3 assassinated presidents. and 7 more countries have lost 2, including France and Peru.
President Garfield was, undiplomatically, shot by a disgruntled diplomat. Though it turned out the surgeon who treated him administered the coup de grace. Plunging his unwashed hands into the gunshot wound led to sepsis and an agonizing death for the president. His assassin had a point when he claimed, "The doctors killed Garfield. I just shot him." FDR wasn't even the target when days before his first inauguration he found himself in the crossfire of an attempt on the life of Chicago's mayor. Possibly ordered by this man.
His rendezvous with grim destiny begins a little after noontime as his plane lands in Dallas.
JFK's assassination has generated a depository's worth of books. No matter that the 888-page Warren Commission report concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Even Fidel Castro gave evidence to the investigation, vehemently denying any involvement. And if anyone knew about being the target of assassins, it was Fidel. It's estimated that over the years, the CIA dreamt up over 600 plots to kill him. But generally, you can comfort yourself that most attempts on presidents are wildly wide of the mark. Samuel Bick intended to kill Nixon with a hijacked jetliner, but never got off the ground. At least on the day, he chose not to wear the Santa suit he'd previously worn for his White House protests. In 1981, Reagan survived a bullet that stopped an inch from his heart. Thankfully, his doctor was better than Garfield's.
When I saw all those doctors around me, too, I said, I hope they were all Republicans.
But it's not just bullets that you'll need to dodge if you're going for the top job. In 1996, Bill Clinton was minutes away from death as his motorcade was set to cross a bridge in Manila rigged with explosives. At the time, news of the foiled attack was kept secret, though it was revealed later to have been masterminded by an obscure Saudi terrorist living in a cave in Afghanistan, named Osama bin Laden.
It is human choices that move events.
And if assassins don't get you, beware beer snacks, as George W. Bush found in 2002.
Thank you. God bless you, and God bless you.
Even if you make it out alive, you may still have some regrets. Take it from the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. No man will ever bring out of that office the reputation which carries him into it. Its moments of ecstasy would be ransomed by years of torment and hatred. So what have we learned? Well, it really pays to be a war hero, even if that means having your boat sunk. One route with less risk of drowning, although not quite as showy, is to be an attorney. Beware doctors. They may very well turn out to be more deadly than any assassin. When you finally leave the stage, you might get a battleship or high school named after you, but be prepared to make do with a parasitic flatworm. And though sexual misbehavior is not necessarily a bar to high office, history suggests sex or sexuality has been up to now. And in the unlikely event that you make a success of it, well, you'll be long dead before anyone says so.